Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. And in this video, what I want to do is begin another Intro to React series. Again, because React is constantly evolving and changing. Even now, there's proposals for things that'll be in the future of React that are pretty exciting, that will really simplify things. So I always like to kind of do a new Intro to React every once in a while to kind of cover those changes. But what is React? So basically, you might be someone who's new to React watching this now. You haven't watched my previous intros to React. React is, well, here it just kind of says it's a library for building user interfaces. But what does that mean? Because, I mean, I could just write a user interface using just plain HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But oftentimes, when you want to do something a little bit more interactive, like, for example, if you use like Google Docs or any kind of like application where you can do a lot right there in the browser, there's a lot going on. There's a lot that the browser needs to track. And what you see visually needs to change as that data changes. Okay, and if you were doing it with something just like plain JavaScript or jQuery, you would have to write a lot of code to say, hey, when this data changes, to then have to like remove things from the browser window or the DOM and then replace it with like an updated version. Okay, it would be pretty extensive. Like you can do it, but it would require a lot of code. You'd have to kind of think through a lot of patterns, a lot of optimizations. And what React does, and along with other similar frameworks like Vue, Angular, Solid.js, Svelte, Riot.js, these kinds of libraries, what they do is they provide you with the lack of need to have to think through all that stuff. They say, okay, hey, we're going to give you sort of a playbook for describing what your UI should look like and what it should respond to. So like when certain data changes, we should update what the user sees on the screen. And basically being able to declaratively express that. So instead of saying, okay, do this, when I click on this, it triggers this. Instead, what you're doing is you're saying, this is sort of what the page should look like. And then this is what that declaration, this is the data that it depends on. So whenever that data changes, rebuild that template in a sense. Okay, so it allows you to do it declaratively. Instead of saying, hey, what are the steps to build your UI, you're saying, this is what my UI should look like, and then React handles the imperative stuff, handles the, okay, hey, piece of data changed. React already knows under the hood, these are the steps I need to do to rebuild the UI based on your spec. Okay, and again, that's what all these libraries offer, but React is by far currently the biggest of these libraries. So if you're entering like the current job market here in 2022, React is kind of a must-know. Although I highly do recommend learning multiples of these frameworks. If you learn React, Solid.js is going to probably be an easy second one to learn since they both leverage a lot of the same sort of patterns. But I really do also like Svelte and Vue, and Angular has like this really robust tool set. So for when you're building like super heavy duty applications, it can be pretty nice. But they all kind of let you build these sort of like really high user interactive applications, and they all have companies that are hiring you to write code in them. And they all use similar patterns. So once you kind of learn one of these frameworks, it's not too hard to bounce between the others because they're generally solving the same problem just in slightly different ways. But once you can understand like the pattern, like sort of the thinking, the thought process, it's the same thought process across different frameworks. Okay, so that's what React is. So now that we've established like what is it we're going to learn, let's actually do it. So I'm going to open up VS Code. So I'm going to assume that you have Visual Studio Code. That's going to be the editor I'm going to be using, and that you have Node installed. Okay, I'm going to be using Node. If you have Deno and Bun, great, but I'm going to be using Node because it's going to probably be the most ubiquitous JavaScript runtime. Okay, so I'm going to open up VS Code. I have it opened up to a folder called, I created an empty folder called React 18 because we're going to be learning, the current version is 18. And we're going to just start building a React app. Okay. And the thing is that like you can spend your entire career just learning about React because once you kind of really master the core React, then there's all these frameworks that are built on top of React, okay, that give you all sorts of other features and extend what you can do, such as Next.js, Gatsby.js, Remix.js. These frameworks are all built on top of React, and I think there's another one called like Blitz.js. And they'll let you take what you learn in React plus other things and really kind of like take it to the next level. And you can also even use like a lot of the things you learn in React with Astro.js, which is also extremely awesome, especially if you're building like your own personal blog or your portfolio website or something like that. So really kind of getting that core React knowledge down and really focusing on like building that strength will then give you a really nice stepping stone to learn these other frameworks and just keep extending sort of your reach as a developer. And it's the same thing with any of these other frameworks. So if you learn Svelte, Vue, Angular, they're going to have similar frameworks built on top of them that you would then learn after you kind of learn that core library. Okay, cool. So then we got this window open. I'm going to create a new terminal. Actually, I already have one open here. In order to create a new React project, the easiest way to do it is use something called Create React App. Create React App is a tool that Facebook, who creates React, created to make it easy to just kind of create a new project. Because React is just a library, but there's a lot of pieces that go into kind of creating a environment where you can develop React very nicely. So instead of you having to figure out how to put all these different pieces together, Facebook has this little generator that'll just generate you a project with everything kind of already pre-assembled. So that way you can just focus on writing your code for your application. And that is called Create React App. So the way we would use it, we'd use npx. So again, this is a command that comes with Node. I'm using Node, let's see here, Node -- version. I think it's 19 right now. Yep, I have 19. Although I'll very likely, depending on whether Create React App is going to run right now with the version 19, I may use Node Version Manager, which is another thing you can install to switch between versions of Node to downgrade to 16, because sometimes I just have better success when I downgrade to 16. Okay, so let's just first try it with 19. npx create react app. Okay, and then the thing is I always want to use the latest version of Create React App. So just to make sure of that, I'll always add this latest flag. So that way if there's a new version, it makes sure to use the latest version, not the version I've last used. Okay, because Node might cache the last time I do a Create React App, it might cache that version and then reuse it instead of downloading the newest. So I always put that latest flag just in case. So what I do is I run that command, and then after it I put the name of because it's going to create a folder with this new application skeleton, and I want to give it a name for that folder. So we'll call it like first app. Okay, so I'll do that npx create react app at latest first app. And then that's going to run this thing, which will take a minute. And then again, if this doesn't get started in a second, I'm going to just downgrade to 16. Again, I don't think it's necessarily an issue with Node 19. I just think it's more like something with my environment that just means just generally it works better when I downgrade to 16. So at least particularly with React for some reason. Give it another second. Going once, going twice, and sold. Okay, so I'm going to downgrade to 16. So if you have Node Version Manager installed, then again, how do you install Node Version Manager? Google how to install Node Version Manager for your operating system, like how to install NVM for Mac, how to install NVM for Linux, and you'll find a blog article with all the steps. But once you have it installed, you'll be able to use this command, NVM, and I can just then, if I want to install a new version, I could just be like install like 17, it'll install Node 17. But if I want to switch between versions, I can be like NVM use and specify which version I want to use. So I want to use 16. Okay, so now I'm switched over to 16. Okay, and that's really useful because there are going to be certain times when you use certain frameworks and libraries that work better or worse with different versions of Node. And it's just nice to be able to switch between them easily. So I'm going to run that command again, npx create react app at latest first app. And let's see here. There we go. And that's technically what you should be seeing. So you see like it's building out the app. See it created this folder over here. Okay, and with my package.json. Okay, and I'll just pause it while I finish this because it can take a few minutes. Cool, so once you see this screen, that means we are good. Now again, keep in mind that when I ran that command, I'm in the React 18 folder, but again, this whole application is inside this first app folder. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is cd into first app or change directories into first app. So that way I make sure that I'm in the first app directory. And if you like my prompt, so you like how my prompt is laid out in my terminal, I have something special installed called starship.rs. You can just Google that and install it. It's really nice because it gives you all this information in your command prompt so you constantly know like, hey, what version of Node am I using? What branch is my Git repository in? Or, if you're logged into AWS, like, hey, what AWS region am I working out of right now? So that's always very useful. But then what we do is that we can actually run, and again, whenever you're working with a node project, you can always see what the commands are by going to your package.json. So you can see here, there's all these pre-made scripts, because again, this whole environment is already kind of pre-made for us so that we have a nice starting place for our React app. And in order to kind of run in development mode, we're going to use this npm start command. Technically, what would happen is that when you're done building the app, you would then run this build command, which would actually output the actual files you would deploy. Usually, you don't need to do that. Like when you use platforms like Netlify, Vercel, they'll do that for you. I'm not going to get into React testing during this intro course, but technically, if you want to run tests on React, that's how you would do it. And this eject command, I wouldn't worry about. It does an advanced thing that 99% of the time you won't need. Okay, but for people who really need to kind of granularly customize what's going on under the hood, that's going to let them do that. Okay, so that's all we really care about is this command right here. So to run that command, we can type in either npm run start, but what's cool is that Node, you have a unique treatment of specifically the start command. So instead of having to type in npm run build, npm run test, for start, I can just do npm start. Okay, only for start does that work. Okay, so I type in npm start, and what it does, it's going to begin running our dev server, which will automatically open the browser and show the state of our React app. Okay, so there's our React app. Now, another thing you're going to want to do while you're here is you want to download, see, like I have these two extra cool things right here in my DevTools. That is a tool called React Dev Tools. You're going to want to install that. It's going to make your life a lot easier. I have a separate video where I kind of go really in depth about how to use the React Developer Tools. So just look up like React Developer Tools Masterclass on YouTube. Highly worth watching. Like this is going to make your life a lot easier when it comes to developing React apps, because you'll be able to kind of like see what's going on specifically from a React perspective in your app. And it'll also help you, it'll better understand sort of what's going on in your code than just looking at the normal like elements and console that you would normally use for like developing an app. Okay, so just keep aware of that. But technically we now have our app set up. Now, basically all the work you really need to do, like just to kind of understand how React works, is that the actual index.html, the HTML file that actually serves your website, because what you're building is what's called a single page application. So instead of having a bunch of HTML files for different pages, there's just one, and you never really touch it. So here's this index.html, and this index.html really only has one thing, this div. Okay, so what's going to happen is that really your entire website is being built by the JavaScript that you write. Okay, so everything we write in React determines what our website looks like, and what's going to happen is that React is going to take what the JavaScript describes and then swap that out for this div. Okay, so that's what that index.html brings to the table. And so really our code all happens in this source folder. And just to kind of so you can see like the steps, here this index.js, this is where that div swap happens. So you can see here, we create a object called the root. It's called the React root. So essentially it's like, where does the React app get injected? So basically, so we create the root, and we're saying, hey, the root is that div that has the ID of root, because we're using get element by ID. So we're saying, hey, that thing that has the ID of root, that is our root. And then this root.render call takes that root and then swaps it out with whatever you have in the parentheses. So in this case, it's swapping it out with this app component. So if you're looking at this, like this looks weird. It looks like an HTML. It's a special way that you're allowed to write stuff in React called JSX, or JavaScript XML, which is a silly name, but just remember it's JSX. And what JSX is, it looks like HTML, but really what's happening is you're writing this syntax that looks like HTML, and then under the hood, that's being translated into actual like JavaScript. So there's like this, actually under the hood, there's like a function called like react.createElement, and if you actually had to write the JavaScript for this, it would suck. So what they did is they created this really nice way of writing it, and under the hood, in this environment they created, it'll translate all that stuff to the proper JavaScript. So that way you can express stuff in this sort of HTML-like syntax, which is much easier, and then React will just automatically translate it to the proper JavaScript. Okay, don't worry about this strict mode, like that's just a internal sort of setting thing. What matters here is that we're mounting the app component. So essentially what that div is being swapped out with is this thing called a component. And a component is essentially just like a chunk of, think of it as like a chunk of HTML. It's a function. Every component is a function that returns JSX, aka that HTML. Okay, and essentially that app component is defined here. So generally what you do is you create one file per component. That's typically, you don't have to do it that way, but you typically do. So here in this app.js file, you see here it's just a function called app, and all the function does is return this block of HTML, aka JSX. That's all a component is. It's a function that returns JSX. Okay, and this is what's determining what we see on the page, because essentially that div is being swapped out with that component, which is all this. So watch what happens. If I took this component and deleted everything inside this div, okay, the page becomes empty. So let me just, there we go. So just to kind of illustrate this. So always think of this app.js as generally kind of where your application starts. So generally what you're doing is you're building kind of like a DOM, you know, in the browser DOM, there's like that tree. So there's like your HTML tag, and then there's all these tags that kind of follow it underneath. App is the top of your tree. So you're going to build out you could literally just do everything in the app component. You really shouldn't. Generally what you want to do is you want to break your website down to different pieces, different components, and you compose them together. Okay. So for example, I might create, usually what you do is you create a folder called components, and in there you'll create your components. So I'll create a file called header.js, new file called footer.js. Okay, and each of these files, all they need to do is have a function that returns JSX. Okay, so we just write a function. Okay, and we can export it. So I'll just say export default function footer, which, yeah, this is header actually. Header. Okay, and we're just exporting that function. And all this function does is return an h1 that says header. Okay, so that's all this file is doing. So it's literally, we have to export the function, and it's just a function that what it returns is HTML. That's all a component is. Okay, so then we just do the same thing in footer. The only difference is now we're going to call it footer. Okay, and now what I can do is I go to here to app.js, and I can import those components. So import footer. I would import header. And anytime I have a function that returns JSX, I could write it like I would write HTML. So I can write here and just say header footer. And whatever whatever HTML that function returns gets injected in that spot. So you see here like headers on top of footer, because that's the order that I wrote them here. Headers on top of footer. Okay, but instead of me having to write all that HTML here, because who knows how complex that header is, I've encapsulated all the code for header here. So this way I can break down my website into its individual pieces and organize it a little bit more instead of having to try to do everything in one big giant HTML file. Okay, so essentially, and then again, notice how I had to put the slash here. Everything has to have a closing tag. If you don't want to have a closing tag, then you need to have a self-closing slash. Okay, so there's no such thing. So like even for like inputs and images tags, which normally wouldn't need that slash at the end, in traditional HTML, they will need it here. So in the next videos, we'll talk more about like the rules of JSX and whatnot, but this gives you sort of like a quick like lay of the land of how to set up a React project and what it looks like. So I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a great one. Enjoy.